She is a slave meant to serve others. But her life changed when she fell asleep on the Alpha's arms. Please like and subscribe. Thank you. The roasted boar was heavy, a greasy, steaming burden that strained Evelyn's thin arms as she carried it through the throng of celebrating wolves. The scent of it, rich and fatty, turned her empty stomach. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning, but a slave did not eat at the Alpha's mating ceremony. A slave served. Don't stumble, don't drop it, don't be seen. Her mantra was a fragile shield against the reality of her existence. For 3 years, the Silvermane pack had been her gilded prison. Taken as chattel from the ruins of her human village, she was less than a person here. Her only distinguishing feature, the cascade of white braids that fell over her shoulder, was often the first thing the pack members grabbed to yank her into line. It made her easy to spot in a crowd. Her gaze, traitorous and weary, strayed to the high table. To him, Alpha Lucas, he was a king carved from sunlight and storm, his hair a thick tousled mane of gold that caught the firelight like a crown. He was lounging in his throne, a massive construction of dark wood and wolf pelts, his powerful frame draped in soft, dark trousers and a vest of black bear fur that lay open over his chest. He was watching the proceedings with a detached, almost bored intensity, his eyes the color of a winter sky moments before the snow falls, scanning the crowd. He was primal power personified, a predator so apex he no longer needed to snarl. Beside him, his chosen mate, the stunning Ilara, preened in a gown of silver. She was everything a Luna should be, strong, beautiful, pure-blooded, a perfect match for the Golden King. "Move your feet, ghost girl," a sharp voice hissed, followed by a stinging slap on the back of her head. Borvin, the pack's surly cook and her current master, glared at her, his jowls quivering. "The Alpha's table thirsts." "More wine, now!" Evelyn flinched, the familiar burn of humiliation warming her cheeks. She quickly set the heavy platter down on a nearby table and scrambled for the wineskins, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The noise was a physical pressure, the howls, the laughter, the clashing of ale horns. It was the sound of a world that had rejected her. For hours, it continued. Fetching, pouring, clearing. Her muscles screamed, and a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion began to pull at her. Heavier than any platter, it was the fatigue of 3 years of constant vigilance, of swallowed pride, of stifled screams. Every time she passed the high table, the sheer, overwhelming presence of the Alpha seemed to leech what little strength she had left. Her final task was to refill the wine carafe at the Alpha's own table. It was a job she dreaded, requiring her to get closer to him than any slave had a right to be. She moved like a phantom, her empty jug swapped for a full one. As she approached the dais, the world began to swim. The firelight blurred into a golden haze, the noises melting into a dull, buzzing hum. Her vision tunneled until the only thing she could see was the near-empty carafe on the low table beside Lucas's throne. Just get there. Fill it. She knelt, her stiff joints groaning in protest. The task was simple. Unscrew the lid, pour, replace. But as she fumbled with the stopper, a wave of dizziness so potent it stole her breath washed over her. The world tilted. Her arms felt like water. Just for a moment, her mind pleaded, a desperate, broken thing. I just need to rest for a single moment. No one will see. No one will care. She sank back on her heels, intending only to steady herself. Her head, impossibly heavy, lolled to the side. There was something solid beside her. A pillar of warmth in the chill night. Unthinking, driven by a primal need for comfort her conscious mind would never have allowed, she leaned into it. The world dissolved into a blessed, silent darkness. The first sensation was warmth, a deep, radiating heat that seeped into her cheek. The second was scent, not wood smoke or sweat, but something clean and wild. Pine, sun on open fields, male. It was a scent that was both foreign and unsettlingly familiar. A sharp, painful yank on her braid shattered the peace. "You wretched thing." Borvin's roar exploded in her ear as he hauled her backward by her hair. Agony lanced across her scalp, and her eyes flew open. The scene snapped into horrifying focus. She was not kneeling on the cold ground. She had slumped sideways, her head coming to rest against the solid, densely muscled thigh of Alpha Lucas. The soft leather of his trousers was pressed against her cheek. Horror, cold and absolute, flooded her veins. Borvin shook her, her body snapping like a rag doll. "You dare? You filth! You soil the Alpha with your touch on his mating day. I'll flay the skin from your back myself." Spittle flew from his lips, his face a mottled purple mask of rage. He raised a meaty hand, calloused and hard, aimed directly at her face. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow that would surely knock her senseless. It never came. A hand, larger and far more powerful, intercepted Borvin's wrist. The grip wasn't brutal, but it was absolute, freezing the cook's arm in midair. The silence that fell was heavier than any noise. Evelyn dared to look up. Alpha Lucas had moved. He was no longer lounging. He was leaning forward, his stormy eyes fixed on Borvin. He hadn't even stood. He had just reached out and stopped the world. That, Lucas said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that vibrated through the very air, is enough. Borvin's anger evaporated, replaced by pure, undiluted fear. My Alpha, this filth, she defiled you. I decide what is defilement, Lucas interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. His gaze, cold and sharp, remained on Borvin for a moment longer before it slowly, deliberately, shifted to Evelyn. Her breath hitched. He was looking at her, truly looking at her. For the first time, his eyes were not just gray, they were the color of a gathering hurricane, and they took in every detail her wide, terrified eyes. The stark white of her braids against the dark fur of his trousers, the way her entire body trembled. He released Borvin's wrist with a slight push that made the larger man stagger back a step. The cook immediately dropped to his knees, bowing his head to the dirt. Lucas ignored him. His focus was entirely on the trembling human at his feet. You slept, he stated, his voice devoid of the anger she expected. It was filled with something else, a deep, shocking curiosity. He leaned closer, the golden strands of his hair falling across his brow. The movement brought his scent with him, that wild, clean aroma that was now inextricably linked to her utter shame. His proximity was overwhelming, a predator's scrutiny that saw far too much. During my mating ceremony, he continued, his voice dropping so only she could hear, surrounded by my pack. You, a human with no claws, no fangs, no speed. His eyes flickered over her thin frame, her shaking hands. You felt safe enough to use me as a pillow. The observation was so absurd, so terrifyingly accurate in its insanity, that she had no answer. She could only stare, trapped in the storm of his gaze. He was right. It made no sense. The constant, humming fear that had been the soundtrack of her life had simply switched off in his presence. A flicker of something unreadable, not amusement, not anger, but a profound, unsettling intrigue crossed his features. You are either the bravest creature I have ever encountered, he murmured, the words for her alone, or you are touched by the moon herself. His eyes dropped to her white braids, a color not seen among the wolves, and I am beginning to suspect it is not mere bravery. Before she could process the terrifying implication of his words, he straightened up, his attention returning to the frozen, silent pack. The moment of terrifying intimacy was over. Borvin. Lucas's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a blade. This one is no longer yours. You will not touch her again. Is that understood? The cook, still on his knees, nodded frantically. Yes, Alpha. Lucas's gaze swept over his beta, Kale, a grim-faced wolf who had been watching everything with a calculating stillness. Take her to the old sentry post on the western ridge. She stays there. No one sees her. No one speaks to her. Kale dipped his head. Understood. The Alpha's final command was given as he turned his back, dismissing them all. The ceremony is over. Disperse. The spell broke. The pack began to move, a tide of bewildered whispers and shocked glances. Evelyn remained on her knees, a shipwreck survivor. Kale's firm hand closed around her arm, pulling her to her feet. He didn't speak as he led her away from the clearing, away from the firelight and the golden-haired king who had just upended her world. She glanced back once. Lucas was standing now, his back to her, a solitary figure of sun-haired power amidst the dispersing crowd. He had not punished her. He had claimed her. As Kale led her into the dark, silent trees, the reality of her situation settled like a stone in her gut. Her life of predictable, miserable servitude was over. She was now the sole focus of the Alpha's unpredictable, storm-colored curiosity. He hadn't seen a slave to be punished. He had seen a puzzle to be solved. And Evelyn had a terrifying feeling that being a puzzle in the eyes of a wolf like Lucas was far more dangerous than being a slave. The western sentry post was not the dank, filthy cell Evelyn had expected. It was a small, single-room hut built of sturdy pine logs, nestled against a rocky outcrop that shielded it from the worst of the wind. A narrow window, unshuttered, looked out over a breathtaking vista of moonlit valleys and dark, brooding forest. Inside held a simple cot with a real wool blanket, a stone hearth with a neat stack of wood, and a rough-hewn table bearing a pitcher of water and a cloth-wrapped bundle. It was the most private, comfortable space she'd occupied in 3 years, and it felt more like a prison than Borvin's filthy pantry ever had. Kale had shoved her inside with a grunted, "The Alpha's orders stand. You don't leave," before sliding the heavy wooden bar into place on the outside. The finality of the sound echoed in the silence. Evelyn stood frozen in the center of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The adrenaline that had been coursing through her since she'd awoken on Lucas's thigh finally receded, leaving her trembling and hollow. She could still feel the ghost of his warmth against her cheek, the startling gentleness of his grip as he'd stopped Borvin's blow. It was those small, unexpected things that unnerved her more than any overt cruelty. "He is the most dangerous thing in this forest," she reminded herself, her gaze darting around the room. "And he's put you in a cage." Driven by a nervous energy, she investigated the cloth bundle. Inside was a small loaf of dark bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a strip of dried venison. Her stomach clenched with a painful mix of hunger and anxiety. This was not slave's fare. This was a warrior's ration. Why? Was this some part of the game? Fattening up the prey before the hunt? She forced herself to eat a few bites of the bread, chewing mechanically, her ears straining for any sound outside. The only noise was the sigh of the wind through the pines and the distant, mournful cry of a wolf. It was a sound that usually filled her with dread, but tonight, it felt different. It felt like a question. Her mind kept circling back to Lucas's words. Touched by the moon herself. Her hand rose to her white braids. Among the wolves, whose hair ran the gamut from brown to black to rare russet red, her hair was an anomaly, a mark of her otherness. They called her Ghost Girl, Pale Thing. But he had looked at it not with contempt, but with curiosity, as if it were a clue. A soft scuffling sound outside the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. The bar slid back with a gritty scrape. The door didn't swing open. Instead, a figure was shoved unceremoniously inside, stumbling into the center of the room before the door was swiftly barred again. It was a young woman, perhaps a few years younger than Evelyn, with mousy brown hair and wide, fearful eyes. She wore the simple, undyed wool of a household servant. In her hands, she clutched a bucket of water and a fresh linen towel. She stared at Evelyn, her lower lip trembling. Evelyn recognized her. Lyra. One of the few other human servants in the pack. They had never spoken, but they had shared silent, knowing looks across the washing lines. I was told to bring you water for washing," Lyra stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She set the bucket down as if it were hot coal, her eyes darting towards the barred door. "I'm not supposed to speak to you. The Alpha." He forbade it. Evelyn's initial fear cooled into a sharp understanding. This was a test. Of course it was. Lucas had given a direct order, and then sent the most timid, talkative girl in the servant quarters to break it. He was watching. He was always watching. "Then you shouldn't," Evelyn said, her own voice hoarse from disuse. She kept her tone neutral, giving nothing away. She moved to the window, turning her back on the girl, a clear dismissal. She heard Lyra shift nervously behind her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Evelyn could feel the girl's desperate curiosity warring with her fear. "Is it true?" Lyra's whisper was so faint Evelyn almost missed it. "Did you really sleep on him?" Evelyn didn't turn. She kept her gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the forest, a landscape of shadows and secrets. "You should go. They're saying he didn't even get angry." Lyra pressed, a note of awe in her voice. "Borvin was spitting mad in the kitchens, said the Alpha stole his property. But Kale backhanded him for it, said you weren't his anymore, that you belonged to the Alpha now." The words landed like a physical blow. You belong to the Alpha now. It was a different kind of ownership. More terrifying, more absolute. Borvin saw her as a tool. Lucas saw her as, what? A specimen? A riddle? "What's he like?" Lyra breathed, taking a hesitant step closer. Up close. Evelyn finally turned, her face a carefully schooled mask. She looked at the bucket, the towel, the terrified girl. This was her first trial in this new, gilded cage. Her response would be reported. It would get back to him. "He is the Alpha," Evelyn said, her voice flat and final. That is all any of us need to know. Now, take your bucket and leave. Tell whoever sent you that I did not speak to you." Lyra flinched as if struck. The rejection was clear. She scurried to the door and knocked twice. The bar was lifted, and she slipped out, casting one last, wide-eyed glance over her shoulder before the door thudded shut, plunging the room back into silence. Evelyn let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking. She had passed the first test. She had maintained the isolation he had demanded. But for how long? How many more subtle traps would he lay? The isolation was its own kind of torment. With no one to watch, no immediate tasks to perform, she was left alone with the roaring in her own mind. The memory of the ceremony played on a loop, the warmth of his leg, the scent of him, the startling gray of his eyes, so close to hers, the way he had leaned in, his golden hair a messy frame for that fiercely intelligent face, and called her brave. No, she thought, a bitter taste in her mouth. Not brave. Exhausted. There's a difference, but was there? After 3 years of constant, grinding fear, her spirit had been worn so thin that something had finally snapped. In that moment of absolute depletion, some deep, hidden part of her had looked at the most dangerous creature in the territory and had decided, inexplicably, that he was safe. That was the true terror. Not his anger, but her own subconscious betrayal. She spent the next hours in a state of heightened alert, pacing the small confines of the hut, her senses stretched to their limits. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside, made her heart stutter. Was it a guard? A curious pack member? Him? As the moon reached its zenith, painting the room in silvery light, a new sound reached her. Not a footstep, but something lower. A presence. It was a feeling more than a noise, a sudden, profound silence from the forest outside, as if every living thing had frozen in place. The air in the hut grew thick, charged with a potent, wild energy that raised the fine hairs on her arms. He was here. She couldn't see him. She couldn't hear him. But she could feel him, as surely as if he were in the room with her. A primal, powerful awareness that coiled in her gut. The predator was circling his new, puzzling prey. Evelyn stood perfectly still in the center of the moonlit room, her white braids gleaming like strands of pearl. She didn't look at the door. She didn't look at the window. She simply waited, her entire body thrumming with a terrifying anticipation. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in on her from all sides. It was an unbearable weight, a silent demand for a reaction she did not know how to give. Slowly, she turned her head and met the gaze of the massive, storm-gray wolf standing just beyond the window. Its fur was the color of shadows and ash, but its eyes were the same winter sky hue she would know anywhere. Lucas. He was in his wolf form, a beast of pure, untamed power, and he was staring directly at her, his head cocked in that same unnervingly curious way. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the forest. The oppressive presence lifted. The night sounds cautiously resumed. Evelyn's legs gave way, and she sank to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The message was clear. Her cage had no bars he could not pass. Her isolation was an illusion. He was giving her space, but he was never not watching. He was studying her, and she had absolutely no idea what he would do when he finally understood what he was looking at. She was no longer just a slave who had transgressed. She was a possession that had captured the full, focused attention of its owner. Some hours later, the scent of her was everywhere in the small hut. Lucas stood just inside the doorway, the early morning light casting his long shadow across the floorboards she had paced all night. Kale stood beside him, a solid, silent presence. The room was tidy, the cot neatly made, the food from last night mostly uneaten. It spoke of a disciplined mind, one that maintained order even in the midst of terror, but it was her scent that held him captive. Not the faint, soapy smell of the servant girl who had brought the water, nor the lingering aroma of bread and venison. Beneath it all was her, a clean, sharp fragrance like winter air after a snowfall, with a subtle, underlying note of something wild wolf's bane and cold stone. It was the scent that had slammed into him with the force of a physical blow during the ceremony, a scent that had called to the deepest, most primal part of his wolf the moment her head had rested against him. "It's confirmed," Kale said quietly, his voice pulling Lucas from his thoughts. The beta held out a small, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. The raid on Oakhaven, 3 years ago. The records are sparse, but her name is there. Evelyn. listed among the human captives. Lucas took the journal, his fingers tracing the faded ink. Human captives, that's what they had believed. What he had believed. Until the moon ceremony and the searing, undeniable truth of the mate bond had ignited in his blood. "She is not human, Kael," Lucas said, his voice a low rumble. He looked up, his stormy eyes meeting his betas. Or not entirely. Kael's expression was grim. The white hair, it's a trait of the Frostfang lineage, a line thought to be extinct since the Great War. They were seers, dreamwalkers. Their power was in the spirit, not the body. It would explain why she carries no scent of a shifter, why she appears human. Lucas's gaze swept the room again, seeing it with new eyes. The uneaten food, the evidence of a sleepless night. This wasn't just a resilient slave. This was a woman from a line of revered, almost mythical wolves who had spent 3 years being treated as less than dirt, a seer, forced to scrub floors, a dreamwalker, whose spirit had been so battered by reality that the only escape was a desperate, unconscious sleep in the one place her soul recognized as safe. With him, the thought sent a fresh wave of possessive fury through him. He had spent the night in his wolf form, watching her from the trees, wrestling with the tempest inside him. The urge to storm the hut, to claim what was his, had been a fire in his veins. But the sight of her pacing like a caged spirit, her white braids a ghostly banner in the moonlight, had stayed his hand. She was fragile, not in body, but in spirit. She had suffered enough. "She doesn't know," Lucas stated, more to himself than to Kael. "She has no idea what she is, or what I am to her. The bond would be a one-sided echo for her," Kael agreed. "A pull she can't explain. An instinct she'd dismiss as fear or madness." He shifted his weight. "Alara is agitated. She demands to know why a slave warrants your attention, let alone your protection." Lucas's jaw tightened. Alara was a complication, a political choice, a strong Luna candidate from a powerful bloodline. The mating ceremony had been a formality, a step toward securing an alliance, and then the moon spirit had intervened, presenting him with a mate that made no political sense, but whose bond was an undeniable, sacred truth. "Ilara is no longer my concern," Lucas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My priority is Evelyn. She is to be protected, at all costs. No one touches her. No one frightens her. Is that clear?" Kael dipped his head. "The pack will talk. They will see it as weakness. An alpha obsessed with a broken human." A low growl rumbled in Lucas's chest. "Let them talk. They will learn the meaning of my strength when I tear out the throat of anyone who so much as looks at her with disrespect." He closed the journal, the decision solidifying within him. She has been a ghost in this pack for 3 years. It ends now. Some hours later, Evelyn started awake as the bar on the door slid back. She hadn't meant to sleep, but exhaustion had finally claimed her on the floor near the hearth. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering, expecting Borvin's snarling face or Lyra's timid curiosity. Instead, it was the beta, Kael. And he was not alone. 2 stern-faced she-wolves stood behind him, their postures rigid. They carried a copper tub between them, followed by others with buckets of steaming water, soft-looking towels, and folded garments of a deep, forest-green wool. "Bathe," Kael commanded, his voice devoid of warmth but lacking its previous hostility. "You will be presented to the Alpha in 1 hour." The women set down their burdens and filed out without a word, their eyes carefully averted from hers. The message was clear. She was no longer part of their world, but she was not yet part of the Pax. She was something in between, something owned by the Alpha. The hot water was a luxury she had almost forgotten. As she sank into the tub, the heat seeped into her aching muscles, washing away the grime and fear of the last day. The soap was fragrant with pine needles, a scent that, for the first time, didn't remind her of her captivity, but of the wild, clean forest outside her window. The green wool dress they had left was simple but beautifully made, soft against her skin. It was the color of the deep woods, a color that made her white braids seem to glow. There were no undergarments of rough hemp, but soft linen. It was a quiet, unsettling kindness. When Kael returned exactly 1 hour later, his eyes flickered over her with a hint of surprise, quickly masked. He grunted, "Come." He led her not to the great clearing, nor to the Alpha's lodge, but to a smaller, private building nestled among the ancient pines behind it, the Alpha's personal quarters. Her throat went dry. The main room was spacious and sparsely furnished, dominated by a large hearth where a fire crackled. The walls were hung with maps and tapestries depicting the pack's history. It was a place of power, of history. And it was terrifying. Lucas stood before the fire, his back to her. He had changed into a clean, dark tunic and trousers, his golden hair still damp. He didn't turn as they entered. "Leave us," he said, his voice echoing softly in the room. Cale bowed and withdrew, closing the door silently behind him. Evelyn stood frozen, her hands clenched in the soft fabric of her new dress. The silence stretched, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. She could feel the weight of his presence filling the room, a tangible force. Finally, he turned. His stormy eyes found hers immediately, and the intensity of his gaze was like a physical touch. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his gaze traveling from her freshly washed white braids, over the green dress that fit her far too well, down to her bare feet on the woven rug. It was a slow, thorough assessment, but it lacked the lecherous quality of the warriors who sometimes leered at the female servants. This was different, deeper, as if he were memorizing her. "You are from Oakhaven," he stated, his voice quiet but absolute. The statement was so unexpected it knocked the air from her lungs. Oakhaven. A name she hadn't dared speak in 3 years. A memory of wood smoke and her mother's laughter, now tinged with the coppery scent of blood and the sound of screams. She could only nod, her throat tight. The Frostfang line was renowned there. He continued, taking a slow step toward her. Seers. Advisors to kings in the Age of Men. Their strength was not in tooth and claw, but in the spirit. Their hair turned white with the awakening of their gift. Evelyn's heart stuttered to a stop. Frostfang. The word meant nothing to her, and yet it resonated in some deep, forgotten part of her soul. Her hand flew to her braids. I don't understand. "You have been sleeping in the den of wolves, little one," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He was close now, close enough for her to feel his body heat, to drown in his scent. "But you were never a lamb. You are a wolf of a different winter." He reached out, and before she could flinch away, his fingers brushed against a single white braid that lay over her shoulder. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, undiluted awareness that shot straight to her core. It was not the harsh grab she was used to. It was a caress. Her eyes flew to his, wide with shock and confusion. His gaze was unreadable, a turbulent sea of gray. But in its depths, she saw no mockery, no cruelty. She saw a fierce, burning certainty. "You have suffered enough in this pack," he murmured, his fingers still tracing the length of her braid, a gesture of possession so gentle it shattered her defenses. "That ends now. No one will harm you again. No one will treat you as less than what you are." "What am I?" she whispered, the question torn from her. For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. It was a predator's smile, full of promise and peril. "That," he said softly, finally releasing her braid, "is what we are going to find out." The door to the quarters opened abruptly, breaking the spell. Alara stood there, her face a mask of cold fury, her eyes blazing as they took in the intimate scene. Evelyn in her new dress, standing so close to Lucas, his hand just falling from her hair. Lucas didn't even turn, his eyes remained locked on Evelyn's. "Leave, Alara," he said, his voice flat and final. "You are interrupting." Alara's composure cracked. "You shame me for this. This thing? This pale ghost?" Now, Lucas turned his head, just enough to fix her with a sliver of his gaze. The air in the room grew cold. "You shame yourself," he said, each word a chip of ice. "She is under my protection. Speak of her like that again, and it will be the last word you utter in my territory." Alara looked as if she'd been struck. With a sound of pure rage, she spun and disappeared. The door closed, and silence descended once more, thicker and more charged than before. Evelyn stood trembling, the Alpha's words echoing in her mind. "You have suffered enough. Under my protection." He had not just moved her from a hut to his quarters. He had moved her from the periphery of his world directly into its stormy center. He had drawn a line in the sand, with her on one side and everyone else on the other. And as she looked into the eyes of the golden-haired king who had just declared war on her behalf, she understood one terrifying, undeniable truth. Her old life was not just over, it had been obliterated, and the dangerous, unpredictable future that stretched before her was irrevocably tied to the primal, powerful male who saw a wolf in her when she had only ever seen a slave. The silence after Ilara's departure was a living entity, thick with the echoes of Lucas's threat and the seismic shift it represented. Evelyn stood frozen, the phantom sensation of his fingers on her braid still tingling against her skin. The fine wool of the green dress, once a comfort, now felt like a uniform for a war she hadn't enlisted in. Lucas turned his full attention back to her, the storm in his eyes momentarily banked, replaced by a practical, unnerving calm. "This is where you will stay," he stated, as if it were the most natural conclusion in the world. He gestured around the main room of his quarters. "You'll take the inner chamber." Her gaze darted to the doorway he indicated. A heavy bearskin draped across the opening. The Alpha's private bedchamber. A fresh wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. "I can't. This is your space. I should go back to the sentry post." The words were out before she could stop them. A desperate plea for the familiar, less terrifying prison. His expression didn't change, but a new intensity sharpened his features. The sentry post was a temporary measure. "This," he said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant register that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her bones, "is permanent. You are under my protection, Evelyn. That protection is most effective when you are within the reach of my arm. Within the reach of my arm." The words were not a comfort, they were a claim. They painted a vivid picture of being pulled against that solid, warm chest, of being shielded by the very body that could so easily break her. The duality of it was maddening. Why? The question was a breath, a final, fragile attempt to understand the incomprehensible. "Why are you doing this? I am nothing, a slave, a human." She deliberately used the words that had defined her, a shield against the strange, terrifying narrative he was weaving about Frostfangs and Seers. For a long moment, he just looked at her, and she had the unnerving sense that he could see every crack in her armor, every shadow of fear in her heart. "You fell asleep on me," he said finally, a simple, stark statement of fact. "In a room full of predators, you found a moment of peace on the one being who could end your life with a twitch of his hand. That is not nothing. That is a truth so profound it defies every law of this world." He took a single step closer, not crowding her, but dominating the space between them. "I am doing this because the moon spirit has presented me with a riddle, and I do not ignore her gifts." Before she could form a response, the main door opened, and Kale entered again, this time followed by 2 young warriors carrying a large wooden chest. They avoided looking at her, their focus entirely on their alpha. "Her things from the servants' lodge," Kale said, his tone neutral. Evelyn almost laughed. Her things would fit in a single pocket. A spare, ragged tunic. A broken comb. A smooth river stone her younger brother had given her a lifetime ago. The sight of the chest was absurd. Lucas nodded. "Put it in the inner chamber." As the warriors passed, he reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft gray fur, were not her rags, but new garments. A pair of supple leather trousers, a tunic of the same forest green wool, sturdy boots, and a heavy hooded cloak lined with rabbit fur. There were also hair ties made of woven leather and a bone-handled brush. It was a trousseau. A warrior's trousseau. "You can't be serious, Lucas." The voice came from the doorway. Ilara had returned, her silver gown swapped for practical leathers, her face a carefully composed mask of concern, though her eyes burned with a cold fire. "The pack is whispering. They see you housing a slave in your den, dressing her like a pack member. It undermines you. It undermines all of us." Lucas didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes on Evelyn, watching her reaction to the clothes. "The pack will learn," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that my authority is not subject to their whispers. And she is not a slave, not anymore." "Then what is she?" Ilara's voice sharpened, losing its feigned concern. "What is she, Lucas, that you would cast aside tradition, insult your chosen, for a pale-haired creature who doesn't even have a wolf?" Finally, Lucas turned his head. The look he gave Ilara was so devoid of warmth it could have frozen the hearth fire. "She is my guest. And my concern. Your role here is done, Ilara. The alliance with your pack will be honored. But you will not question me again on this matter." The finality in his tone was absolute. Ilara's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She shot a look of pure, undiluted venom at Evelyn, before turning and striding away, her footsteps echoing like cracks of ice. The warriors finished their task and left with Kale, leaving Evelyn alone once more with the Alpha. The confrontation had sucked all the air from the room. "She's right, you know," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. The pack will see this as weakness. They will challenge you because of me. A slow, predatory smile touched Lucas's lips, the first genuine one she had seen. It transformed his face from sternly beautiful to devastatingly fierce. Let them try, he murmured, a dark promise gleaming in his stormy eyes. It has been too long since I've reminded my pack why I am alpha. He gestured toward the chest. Change into something practical. We are going for a walk. A walk? She repeated, bewildered. You have lived in my territory for 3 years and have only seen the underbelly of it, he said, moving toward the door. It is time you saw its heart, and it is time my pack saw you walking at my side. The challenge in his words was unmistakable. This was not a suggestion. It was a command, a test, for her and for his wolves. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and something else, something that felt dangerously like a spark of defiance. She retreated into the inner chamber, her fingers trailing over the soft fur in the chest. The leather trousers were buttery soft, the tunic warm and well-made. She dressed quickly, her hands fumbling with the unfamiliar fastenings. The boots fit perfectly. As she braided her white hair back with one of the new leather ties, she caught a glimpse of herself in the polished surface of a bronze wash basin. The person staring back was a stranger, not a slave, not a ghost. She looked capable, like she belonged in the wildness of this place. The transformation was as terrifying as it was empowering. When she emerged, Lucas was waiting by the door. His eyes swept over her, and a flicker of something hot and approving flashed in their gray depths, so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. Good, he said simply. He opened the door and stepped out into the late afternoon light, not checking to see if she followed. It was its own kind of test. Did she have the courage? Evelyn took a deep, shuddering breath, the clean, cold air filling her lungs. Then, she stepped out of the den and into the heart of the Silvermane pack, walking just a pace behind the golden-haired alpha. The effect was instantaneous. The casual activity of the camp warriors sparring, women tanning hides, children chasing each other between the lodges slowed, then stopped entirely. Every conversation died. Every eye turned to them. The silence was heavier and more hostile than any she had ever endured. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their confusion, their rage. It was a physical pressure, a wall of animosity, but then she felt another pressure, the solid radiating heat of Lucas's presence beside her. He didn't look left or right. He didn't acknowledge the stares. He simply walked, his stride confident and powerful. A king surveying his domain with his most controversial subject at his heel, and with every step, a strange thing happened. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, not replaced by bravery, but by a dawning, iron-hard resolve. He had drawn his line. He had declared his protection. As they passed a group of young, bristling warriors, one of them, emboldened by the crowd, let out a low, mocking growl directed at her. Lucas stopped. He simply stopped. And his entire body went still, in a way that was more threatening than any movement. The power that rolled off him was a palpable wave, silencing the camp once more. He slowly, deliberately, turned his gaze toward the young warrior. The wolf's bravado evaporated. He dropped his eyes, his shoulders hunching in immediate, instinctive submission, a low whine escaping his throat. Lucas held the stare for a moment longer, a silent, brutal lesson, before he continued walking as if nothing had happened. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. This was the reality of his protection. It was not gentle. It was absolute, violent, and uncompromising. He was showing the pack, and showing her, exactly what it meant to be under his care. They walked to the edge of the camp, to a high bluff that overlooked the entire valley. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. For a long time, they stood in silence, watching the light die over the territory that was his to rule, and her new, terrifying home. They will not accept me, she said softly, the wind whipping her white braids around her face. They don't have to, Lucas replied, his voice a low rumble beside her. They only have to obey. He turned to look at her, his profile etched against the fiery sky. Your only task is to learn what you are. The rest is my concern. In that moment, standing on the edge of the world with the most dangerous wolf she had ever known, Evelyn felt the last vestiges of her old identity. The slave, the ghost, the victim slough away like a discarded skin. She was in the wolf's den now, and the wolf, for reasons she still couldn't fathom, had decided she belonged there. The path ahead was shrouded in shadow and threat, But for the first time, she was not walking it alone. She was walking it in the long, possessive shadow of the alpha, and the thought sent a shiver through her that was not entirely from the cold. The silence on the bluff was a fragile thing, stretched taut between the echo of Lucas's words and the vast, humming life of the territory below. She risked a glance at his profile, stark against the dying sun. He wasn't looking at the view anymore. His stormy gaze was fixed on the tree line, but she knew his attention was like a net, cast wide, feeling for any ripple of dissent, any threat to the new order he had imposed with her at his side. The submission of the young warrior had been a public lesson, but she was naive if she thought it had ended the conversation. "We should return," Lucas said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. The walk back to his den was a reverse of their earlier journey, the pack's stares now layered with a wary, simmering resentment they were careful to hide from their alpha. They passed the training grounds, where the clang of practiced swords and the thud of bodies hitting the packed earth created a rhythm of controlled violence. As they neared the central fire pit, a group of she-wolves, Ilara's inner circle, stood gathered. They fell silent as Lucas and Evelyn approached, their eyes sharp as daggers. One of them, a brunette with a cruel twist to her mouth named Anya, held a large basket of mending. As Evelyn passed, Anya stumbled, and the basket flew from her hands, scattering tunics and socks across the muddy, trodden snow at Evelyn's feet. "Oh, clumsy me," Anya simpered, her eyes glinting with malice as she looked not at Evelyn, but at Lucas, testing the boundaries of his decree. "The ghost girl will pick them up, won't she? She's so good at being on her knees." The insult hung in the cold air. Lucas went still beside her, the warning growl building in his chest, a vibration Evelyn could feel through the soles of her boots. But before Lucas could act, a different kind of cold swept through Evelyn. It wasn't the chill of the evening air, it was an internal frost, a sudden, glacial calm that descended over her panic and shame. She looked at the muddy clothes, at Anya's smug face, and the 3 years of humiliation, the slaps, the slurs, the endless, grinding degradation, formed into a single, sharp point of ice in her chest. She simply looked at Anya and whispered, "No." As she spoke, a wave of intense cold radiated from her, invisible but tangible. The mud around the scattered clothes instantly froze, trapping the fabric in a sheet of rime. A fine, glittering frost crackled over the basket itself, and the dampness on Anya's tunic sleeve crystallized into a delicate, frozen lace. Anya gasped, yanking her arm back and staring at the frozen mud and the frost on her sleeve with wide, horrified eyes. The other she-wolves recoiled, their smugness replaced by superstitious fear. They weren't looking at a slave anymore. They were looking at something uncanny. Evelyn stared, her own breath catching in her lungs, a plume of white in the suddenly frigid air. What did I do? The thought was a scream inside her head. The cold feeling receded as quickly as it had come, leaving her trembling and hollow. She hadn't done that. She couldn't have. It was the wind, a trick of the light, but the evidence was there, solid and unmelted in the twilight. Lucas's reaction was not what she expected. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. The growl in his chest quieted. He stepped forward, his boot crunching on the frozen mud. He ignored the terrified she-wolves, his focus entirely on the ice. "It seems," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "that you have a chill, Anya. You should go warm yourself by the fire. All of you." The dismissal was absolute, and this time, it was laced with a new, unspoken threat. They scattered, Anya clutching her frost-rimed sleeve, casting terrified glances over her shoulders. The moment they were alone, the full force of Lucas's attention swung back to Evelyn. She was shaking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her mind reeling. That wasn't me," she stammered, taking a step back from him, from the evidence of her own impossibility. He closed the distance between them in one swift stride, his presence overwhelming. "Look at it," he commanded, his voice low and intense. He didn't touch her, but he loomed, forcing her to look at the frozen patch of ground. "That is Frostfang power, the spirit influencing the physical world. A whisper of winter from a line of wolves who walked in dreams." "No," she whispered, the denial weak, pathetic. "I'm human." "You are my mate," he growled, the words finally spoken aloud. A truth so immense it shattered the last of her denials. She stared at him, her world tilting on its axis. Mate. The word explained everything and nothing. The pull she felt, his inexplicable protection, the way her soul had recognized his as safe. It was a sacred bond, the foundation of shifter society, and it was between the Alpha and a what? A witch? A ghost? A frostfang? The bond is one-sided for now, he continued, his gaze burning into her. You feel the pull, but you don't understand it. Your wolf, your spirit is dormant, buried under years of survival. But it is waking up. He gestured to the frost. It is defending you. I can't be what you want me to be. His expression softened, a minute shift that was more devastating than any smile. You already are, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate rumble. You just have to stop fighting it. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and began walking toward his den, leaving her standing alone in the gathering dark, surrounded by the frozen proof of a heritage she had never known and a power she couldn't control. The walk back was a blur. The pack members who saw her now gave her a wide berth, their eyes no longer just resentful, but fearful. The story of the frost would spread faster than fire. She was no longer just the Alpha's perplexing interest. She was a potential threat. Back inside the quiet of his quarters, the door closed on the whispering world. Evelyn stood shivering by the hearth, though the fire was blazing. The cold she had summoned seemed to have settled deep inside her bones. Lucas poured a cup of mulled wine from a pot hanging over the fire and held it out to her. Drink. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was another jolt, but this one was pure warmth, a counterpoint to the ice in her soul. She sipped the spiced wine, the heat spreading through her, anchoring her. What happens now? She asked, her voice small. Now, he said, leaning against the mantel, his powerful frame silhouetted by the flames. We wait. For what? For the next time you are threatened, he replied, his stormy eyes holding hers. For the next time your power decides it will not be ignored. Your wolf is a survivor, Evelyn. It has been sleeping, but it is not gentle. It is learning how to fight back. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And I will be here, watching. I will be here when it finally decides to stop hiding and come out to play. The promise or the threat hung in the air. He wasn't going to coddle her. He was going to force her to awaken, to confront the truth of her own nature. No matter how violent or frightening the process might be, she was his mate. And he would have all of her, even the parts she herself feared, even the part that could summon winter with a whisper. The game had changed once again. She was no longer just a possession or a puzzle. She was a dormant volcano, and the Alpha was standing guard, waiting patiently for the eruption. The warmth of the mulled wine did little to thaw the ice of revelation lodged in Evelyn's chest. Lucas's words echoed in the silence of the den, a truth that had reshaped the very ground beneath her feet. He watched her from his place by the hearth, a silent, powerful sentinel waiting for the dust to settle inside her. She finally set the empty cup down, the clink of pottery on wood unnaturally loud. The Frostfang line, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. You said they were seers, dreamwalkers. Is there anything left of them? Any records? Stories? The question was a lifeline, a way to anchor this terrifying new reality in something concrete, something other than the bewildering power that had erupted from her own hands. Lucas studied her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. The pack archives. There are scrolls, histories from before the Great War. The Frostfangs were allies of the Silvermane once. He pushed off from the mantle. I will take you there tomorrow. Tomorrow. It felt both an eternity away and terrifyingly close. I want to go now. A flicker of surprise, then approval, crossed his features. The archivist, Oren, is an old wolf, set in his ways. He may not be welcoming. I am used to it, she said, a thread of her old resilience weaving back into her voice. This, at least, was familiar ground, facing hostility, but this time, it was for a purpose. She needed to know who she was, what she was. Lucas's lips quirked in a near smile. So be it. The pack archives were housed in a low, circular building of stone and timber, nestled against the mountain itself, separate from the main lodges. The air inside was cool and dry, smelling of old parchment, leather, and dust. It was a sacred silence, a stark contrast to the vibrant, often brutal life of the pack. An ancient shifter with a long gray beard and eyes clouded by cataracts looked up from a sprawling scroll as they entered. Alpha, Oren rasped, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He did not acknowledge Evelyn. Oren, we need to see the histories of the Frostfang lineage, Lucas commanded, his tone leaving no room for refusal. The old wolf's milky eyes shifted past Lucas to land on Evelyn, and his wrinkled face tightened with distaste. The human has no place here among our sacred texts. She is not human. Lucas's voice dropped, a clear warning growl underlying the words. And she is with me. Oren's jaw worked, but he was too old and too entrenched in tradition to be cowed completely. He gestured a gnarled hand toward a dark, secluded corner of the archive. The scrolls you seek are there, the ones that survived the purges. Lucas was immediately waylaid by Kale, who appeared at the entrance with an urgent look, needing the Alpha's attention regarding a border patrol. Lucas shot Evelyn a questioning look. "I'll be fine," she said, her gaze already fixed on the dark corner Oren had indicated. This was something she needed to do alone. With a final, warning glance at the unrepentant Oren, Lucas left with Kale. The moment the Alpha was gone, the atmosphere in the archive shifted. Oren pointedly turned his back on her, his silence a louder insult than any curse. Evelyn ignored him, her heart thudding with a mixture of trepidation and desperate hope as she moved toward the Frostfang records. The corner was neglected, the air even colder. A single, small chest, banded with tarnished silver, sat on a low shelf. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a handful of scrolls, their edges brittle. With reverent, trembling hands, she unrolled the first one. The script was elegant and flowing, describing the Frostfangs not as warriors, but as advisors, diplomats, and spiritual guides. Their strength lies not in the shift of form, but in the shift of perception, one passage read. They walk the paths of dreams, speak with the voice of the moon's chill, and their hair is the color of the first winter snow, a mark of the spirit's purity and power. Another scroll depicted a family tree, her breath catching as she traced the names with her finger. There, at the very bottom, a line led to a name that had been hastily scratched out, but not thoroughly enough to hide it. Anya Frostfang, M. Elias of Oakhaven. Anya, her grandmother. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold racked her body. It was real. Her family, her legacy, they had hidden themselves among humans, their power dormant, their lineage a secret, until it had manifested in her. The raid that destroyed Oakhaven hadn't just killed humans. It had unknowingly slaughtered the last remnants of a legendary wolf bloodline and taken one of their own as a slave. The irony was so bitter it made her eyes sting. "Finding what you're looking for, Ghost?" The voice, smooth as silk and cold as ice, came from behind her. Evelyn flinched, hastily re-rolling the scroll as Alara stepped out of the shadows between the tall shelves. She must have been waiting. "This area is restricted," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice level, invoking the only authority she had, Lucas's. Alara's laugh was a soft, cruel sound. "Is it?" Oren seems to have forgotten his duties. She circled Evelyn, her eyes raking over the open chest, the scroll in Evelyn's hands. "So this is what he sees in you, a dead bloodline, a parlor trick with Frost." She stopped directly in front of her, her beauty sharp and menacing. "Do you really think a few old scrolls and the ability to freeze a puddle make you worthy of an alpha?" Evelyn said nothing, clutching the scroll to her chest like a shield. "He pities you," Alara hissed, leaning in close. "That is all this is. A strong alpha's pity for a broken, pretty thing. He will grow bored of this game. He will see that strength, real strength, lies in a union that fortifies his pack, not in coddling a relic." The words were meant to wound, and they did, because they echoed her own deepest fears. But something else was rising in her, hotter than the shame, a spark of defiance, fanned by the words of her ancestors. The shift of perception. "You're afraid of me," Evelyn realized aloud, her voice quiet but clear. Ilara's composure cracked. "Afraid? Of you?" "Not of me," Evelyn corrected, meeting her furious gaze. "Of what I represent, that your strength, the strength of tooth and claw you value so much, might not be the only kind that matters to him." Rage, pure and unadulterated, flashed in Ilara's eyes. In a movement too fast to follow, her hand shot out, not to strike Evelyn, but to grab the scroll she was holding. "This garbage belongs in the fire." She yanked, but Evelyn held on, the brittle parchment tearing between them. A jolt, like static electricity, passed from the torn scroll into Evelyn's hands. The air in the archive grew deathly cold. The torches in their sconces flickered, their flames turning a pale, eerie blue. A fine, glittering rime bloomed across the stone floor, racing from Evelyn's feet toward Ilara, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it wasn't just cold. A vision, sharp and painful, slammed into Evelyn's mind, projected from the torn scroll, from the rage, from the awakening power within her. She saw Ilara, not as she was, but as a child, small and terrified, being passed over for a blessing by a former alpha, deemed not fierce enough. She felt the crushing weight of that rejection, the desperate, lifelong drive to prove her worth, to be the fiercest, the strongest, to never be overlooked again. The vision lasted only a second, but it was long enough. Ilara gasped, stumbling back as if struck, the torn piece of scroll falling from her nerveless fingers. The frost on the floor halted. The torches returned to normal. She stared at Evelyn, her face a mask of not just hatred, but of a violated, terrified shock. What did you do to me?" Evelyn could only stare back, breathless. She hadn't just summoned winter. She had seen a memory, a secret, painful memory. She had walked in a dream that wasn't her own. The sound of heavy footsteps approached. Lucas appeared at the end of the aisle, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. The torn scroll, the frost on the floor, Ilara's horrified face, Evelyn's stunned one. "Ilara," his voice was a whiplash. "Explain," but Ilara couldn't. She just shook her head, backing away from Evelyn as if she were a venomous snake, before turning and fleeing the archives. Lucas's gaze fell on Evelyn. "What happened?" She looked down at the torn scroll in her hands, then at the fading frost on the stones. The words from the scroll echoed in her mind. The shift of perception. I saw her," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling with a new, profound fear. "I saw inside her. A memory. A painful one." Lucas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and filled with a grim awe. Not just dreamwalking then, empathy, or intrusion. He stepped closer, his presence a solid wall against her swirling terror. "Your power is not one thing, Evelyn. It is unfolding." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "It's a violation. It is a weapon," he corrected, his gaze intense. "And a shield. You saw her weakness. You understood her drive. Knowledge is power, little Frostfang. Even especially this kind." He picked up the torn piece of parchment from the floor and handed it to her. "Now you know what you are capable of. The question is, what will you do with it?" The question hung in the cold, silent air of the archive. She had sought knowledge of her past, and in doing so, had been given a terrifying glimpse of her future. She could summon winter and steal secrets from souls. And the Alpha, her mate, was not afraid of it. He was waiting for her to embrace it. The walk back from the archives was shrouded in a silence thicker than the mountain mist. The cold power that had surged from her in the training grounds had been frightening. But this violation of Ilara's most private self felt like a desecration. She could still feel the echo of that little girl's shame, a bitter taste in her mouth. Lucas didn't speak until they were back within the sanctuary of his den, the heavy door closing out the world and its prying eyes. The fire crackled, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill clinging to her spirit. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he observed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. He wasn't mocking her. It was a simple, stark statement of fact. "I feel like I became one," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. She stood before the hearth, but she couldn't stop shivering. "I saw a piece of her, something she never meant to share. It's monstrous." He moved then, not with his usual predatory grace, but with a deliberate, grounded solidity. He came to stand behind her, so close she could feel the heat of his body through the wool of her tunic. "The wolf does not apologize for its teeth," he said, his breath stirring the fine hairs at her temple. "The storm does not apologize for the rain. Your power is a part of you, Evelyn. It is not monstrous. It is survival, refined. It is the weapon your spirit forged in the dark to protect itself." His words were like a balm and a brand all at once. They absolved her of the guilt, but they also cemented the terrifying reality. This was her now. There was no going back to being the invisible slave. "How do I control it?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How do I stop it from leaking out?" "You don't." His hands came up then, to settle on her shoulders. His touch was firm, warm, a grounding weight that seeped through the leather and wool, straight into her trembling muscles. "You don't cage a storm. You learn to ride it. You learn its currents, its triggers." His thumbs began to move in slow circles, kneading the tight, knotted tension from her shoulders. It was an intimacy so unexpected, so profoundly gentle, that it stole her breath. This was not the alpha commanding his subject. This was something else. Something for her alone. She let her head fall forward, a soft sigh escaping her as the practiced pressure of his hands began to unravel the panic coiled in her spine. "And you'll teach me?" The question was barely a whisper, a surrender she hadn't known she was capable of. "I will be the wall your storm breaks against," he murmured, his voice dropping to that intimate register that seemed to resonate in her very bones. His hands slid from her shoulders, down her arms, a slow, steadying caress before he turned her to face him. "I will not let you shatter, but you must learn to stand in the center of the gale." His stormy eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw no fear of her power, no revulsion at what she had done. She saw a fierce, unwavering certainty. He believed in her, not in the fragile human she had been, but in the powerful, untamed creature she was becoming. He raised one hand, his fingers hovering just beside her cheek. "May I?" The request, so simple, so respectful, undid her completely. After years of being grabbed, shoved, and slapped, this conscious asking for permission was a language she had almost forgotten. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. His fingertips brushed her skin, tracing the line of her jaw. The contact was electric, but it was a different kind of current than the icy power that had flooded her in the archives. This was warmth, life, a connection that felt more real, more fundamental than anything she had ever known. His touch was calloused from weaponry and rule, yet incredibly gentle. "The better version of yourself is not a tamer one, Evelyn," he said, his thumb stroking over the apple of her cheek. "It is a more complete one. It is the woman who is no longer afraid of her own shadow, because she understands that the shadow is just another part of her, waiting for the moon to give it form." Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear or sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming release. For 3 years, she had been fighting herself, trying to be smaller, quieter, less. She had been at war with her own spirit, and he was offering her a truce. No, more than a truce, an alliance. He saw her tears, and his expression softened further. He didn't tell her not to cry. He simply used his thumb to wipe one away, the gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "I don't know how to be that person," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "You are learning," he said simply. "Every time you stand your ground, every time your power rises to defend you, you are learning." He leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. The gesture was one of sheer closeness, of shared breath. His eyes, so close, were a swirling universe of gray. "And I will be here, for all of it." In that moment, surrounded by his heat, his scent, his unshakable belief, the last of her resistance crumbled. The bond she had felt as a terrifying, one-sided pull suddenly felt like a lifeline. It wasn't a chain, it was a tether, keeping her from being lost in the tempest of her own awakening. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling as they came to rest against his chest, over the steady, powerful beat of his heart. It was an answer, acceptance, not just of his protection, but of him, of this path. He didn't move, allowing her this exploration, this first, tentative claiming of her own. His heart hammered under her palm, a wild, potent rhythm that mirrored her own. "The pack will challenge you because of me," she whispered, repeating her earlier fear. But the terror was gone, replaced by a grim understanding. A slow, predatory smile touched his lips, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Let them." He captured her hand, pressing it more firmly against his chest, letting her feel the undeniable strength there. "My strength is not diminished by yours, Evelyn. It is multiplied. Alpha with a strong mate is not weakened. He is unstoppable." He lowered his head, his lips brushing her forehead in a kiss that was not of passion, but of sealing, a promise, a vow. "Rest now," he said, his voice a soft command. "Tomorrow we begin." He led her to the inner chamber, his hand a warm, steadying presence on the small of her back. At the doorway, he paused. "The storm in you is a gift. Never forget that." Then he was gone, leaving her in the quiet of the room, the ghost of his touch on her skin, and the echo of his words in her soul. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now intertwined with something new, something fierce and bright and hopeful. She was his mate. She was a Frostfang. And for the first time, The thought didn't fill her with dread. It filled her with a strange, burgeoning sense of power. Lucas didn't want to break her or cage her. He wanted to see her fly, even if her wings were made of ice and storm. And she, for the first time, wanted to see it too.